Okay, here we go. Lastly, we're talking about depth. And depth is essentially how close something is to you versus how far away things are from you. So this is where we start using words such as foreground, that which is close to you, the background, that which is furthest away, in the background, and the midground, the things that are kind of in between. So let's take a look at this picture here. How can you tell what is closest to you and what is furthest away from you? Well, this is kind of when we go back to the last video we were talking about size. We have relative sizes. We can see this arc with all the Christmas lights is bigger, and then the same shape of the arc over here is smaller, and then smaller and smaller and smaller, smaller. So we know our brain can easily see what's in the foreground, this one, versus what's in the midground, versus what's in the background all the way back here. Right? Otherwise, we would just be looking at a bunch of big little circles, right? How do we know that this little circle right here where my mouse is, which I hope you can see, is at the same distance away from this bigger circle, even though it's probably the same dimensions as one of these circles over here. Again, it's just that size constancy our brain likes, if you remember that from the last video. But again, it's just these shapes, these proportions, these contexts. And having a good depth in your photograph really helps the viewer view your photograph easily, right? We talked about that last video as well. When we have someone look at our photograph, we want their eyes to just relax and look at it. They don't want to try, our brains don't like trying to figure out what's going on. So let's take a look at this picture, for example. There's quite a bit of depth to this picture because we have what's in the foreground, which is me. If we look at the background, it's kind of up for interpretation. We have this mountain, this part of the mountain back here. But I would also argue that this part of the mountain, the brighter part, and these two riders are in the background. And then the midground would probably be like this slope, this rider, and this slope. So how are our eyes differentiating between foreground, midground, and background? Well, again, we have our size differences. Our brain knows that I am and my motorcycle are going to be roughly the same size as this person and this motorcycle and these two motorcycles and their riders. So we can tell that these riders are further away because they are smaller. We know that they're not actually this dimension in real life. We know they're pretty similar to me. But because they are smaller in the picture, we know they're further away. Greater depth. Right? How else can we tell? Tones and colors, right? Just think about looking at mountains in the distance. They usually have like a faded kind of blue color. They look a little hazy like you can see in this picture. We got some haze, we got a faded color, especially compared to this hill right here. It's the same trees, right? It's the same type of trees, but it's further away, and that color difference, the tone difference, helps us figure that out. Another thing we can do is try to blur out the background, which you could kind of see here, right? The background, the trees here are a lot more blurry than I am, right? I'm in focus, everything in the background is out of focus, so that helps. And you can really see that with this effect, which we'll talk about when we actually start taking pictures. This is called a bokeh effect, or bokeh, where the background is just very blurry, so blurry that it creates these large circles. And you can actually start to see that bokeh effect a little bit on the outside of this Christmas light ornament. But what's directly in the foreground, what's in focus, is closest to you. So just by this blurry effect, this bokeh, we can see, yeah, this is closest to the camera. And then as we get further around the sphere, it gets further away. And then whatever the heck was back here is in the background. The next example I'm going to show, which is usually a common complaint, especially from a lot of us when we take pictures on our phones, is when we have We see in real life these tall, great mountains, but then when we take a picture of them, they look pretty small, right? This came from a YouTube video, which I'll link, because it's actually a really good video that shows how we can take mountains and make them appear as they do in real life, larger. Because in the video, you can see that these mountains in the background, those bright ones, are menacing. They're huge. I believe they're the Italian Dolomites, which are just, they're fantastic mountain ranges. So here when we take this picture, we see the mountains. We can kind of see how tall they are. But then when you compare it to this image, all he had to do was zoom in. And we can see that we can get a better sense for how big this mountain range is. And the reason why this zooming in helped was actually it changed the depth of our photograph. Where's the foreground in this image? Right down here, this little hill. And you can probably also argue that these trees are part of the foreground. What's the midground? This hill, the little village here. Background, right in here. These mountains. But when you zoomed in, now what is more in the foreground? Now it's the village. The midground is kind of this parts of the mountains in the shadow, and the background is still the mountains, but they take up a much bigger part of our image now. So it changes that depth a lot more, among other things. When we talk about size and form and all that. So here's a good example of depth and how it can really change our context of the image, the size of what's in our image, so on and so forth.